Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. The hand rises to the face, the fingers curl around the phone, the eyes drift across these words, and somewhere in the theatre of the mind, a voice whispers that these movements belong to something called choice, that the decision to be here, to listen, to continue, existed as a possibility that was selected from a field of other possibilities. But what if that whisper is the gentlest lie consciousness ever told itself? What if the sensation of deciding is nothing more than the afterglow of processes that finished their work long before awareness arrived to claim credit? What if every moment that felt like freedom was simply the universe continuing its unbroken pattern, a pattern that began before the first star ignited and will continue until the last particle finds its final position in the heat death of everything? Before diving deeper into this question that has haunted philosophers for millennia, into this problem that threatens to unravel every assumption about human dignity and responsibility, take a moment to like this video, to subscribe to this channel where a new exploration arrives every single day, to turn on notifications so the next journey finds its way to the screen, and to leave a comment below sharing where in the world these words are reaching. What time zone holds the body while the mind wanders through these ancient and modern labyrinths of thought? Because even if choice is illusion, even if agency is theatre, the sharing creates connection, and connection creates the context in which ideas survive their speakers. The year is 1983, and a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet sits in a laboratory at the University of California, preparing an experiment that will haunt philosophy departments for decades, an experiment so simple in design and so devastating in implication that many will spend careers trying to explain it away, to soften its edges, to find the escape hatch that preserves the feeling that surely, there must be something at the centre of experience that chooses. Libet asks participants to perform a simple task, to flex their wrist whenever they feel the urge, to note the precise moment when the decision to move arises in consciousness. And while they sit there, electrodes rest against their scalps, measuring the electrical activity in the motor cortex, recording the readiness potential, that surge of neural preparation that precedes voluntary action. The results arrive like a quiet earthquake, the kind that doesn't announce itself with drama, but simply rearranges the ground beneath everything built on top of it. The readiness potential begins approximately 550 milliseconds before the action occurs, but the conscious intention to act that moment when the participant reports feeling the decision emerge arrives only 200 milliseconds before the movement, which means the brain has already committed to the action a full third of a second before consciousness knows anything about it, before the sense of willing appears, before the story of choice begins to write itself. The implications spread like cracks through ice, because if the brain decides before the mind knows it has decided, then what exactly is the mind doing? What role does conscious intention play if the outcome was determined before intention arrived? And if this pattern holds not just for wrist flexions, but for every action, every turn of thought, every moment that feels like a decision point, then perhaps consciousness is not the author of behaviour, but merely the narrator, arriving late to scenes already filmed, improvising explanations for events it did not cause and could not have prevented. The Libet experiments did not create the problem of free will. They simply gave it a laboratory address, a set of measurements, a way to transform an ancient philosophical debate into something that could be graphed and replicated. But the debate itself stretches back through centuries, through the mechanistic philosophy of the Enlightenment, through the theological tangles of predestination and grace, through the atomic swerve of Epicurus, who tried to save human freedom by inserting randomness into the behaviour of particles, as if unpredictability could somehow be the foundation of choice, rather than simply another way of being not in control. The determinists have always been there, standing in the corners of philosophy, arguing that every event is the inevitable result of prior events. That the universe is a chain of cause and effect stretching backward to the beginning and forward to the end. That if someone could know the position and velocity of every particle at any moment, they could calculate the entire future with perfect precision. And in such a universe, where would choice fit? What room would exist for the notion that things could have been otherwise? Pierre-Simon Laplace imagined this demon, this hypothetical intelligence that could hold all the data of the cosmos in its awareness, and he concluded that for such a being, nothing would be uncertain. The future as well as the past would be present to its eyes, and though Laplace was describing a mechanical universe of Newtonian physics before quantum mechanics introduced its own complications, the essential question remained: if the present contains the future, the way a seed contains the tree, then what is choice but the name given to ignorance, the word used when the causes are too numerous or too subtle to trace? Baruch Spinoza understood this in the 17th century, understood it with a clarity that still cuts through the fog of wishful thinking, and he wrote that people believe themselves free because they're conscious of their actions but ignorant of the causes that determine them, that a falling stone, if it were conscious, would believe itself to be falling freely, would invent a narrative about deciding to descend, would never suspect that its trajectory was fixed by gravity and momentum and the hand that released it. Spinoza lived in a world that had not yet discovered neurons or readiness potentials, that knew nothing of dopamine or prefrontal cortex activity, but he grasped the essential structure of the problem through pure reasoning, through following the logic of causation to its uncomfortable conclusion, and his philosophy was considered so dangerous, so corrosive to the foundations of moral and religious order, that his books were banned. His name became synonymous with atheism and heresy. Because if human beings do not choose, then how can they be praised or blamed, rewarded or punished? How can the entire apparatus of judgment and desert continue to function if it rests on a mistake about the nature of agency? The answer that Spinoza offered was not comforting. He suggested that free will is a confusion, that what people call freedom is really just acting in accordance with their nature, that true liberation comes not from having choices, but from understanding necessity, from seeing clearly the chains of cause and effect that run through everything, including the self, and finding peace in that understanding rather than rage against it. But this is a difficult teaching, the kind that requires giving up the story that makes life feel meaningful to most people, the story that says effort matters, that trying is noble, that the future is open and responsive to will. Arthur Schopenhauer pushed this further, argued that the will itself, that fundamental striving that seems to animate all living things, is not free but blind, not chosen but given, that people do not select their desires any more than they select the colour of their eyes or the century of their birth, and that all the deliberation, all the weighing of options, all the careful reasoning that precedes action is really just the will watching itself, consciousness observing the outcome of processes it did not initiate and cannot alter. Schopenhauer believed that a person can do what they will but cannot will what they will, that the deepest layer of motivation is opaque to introspection, that by the time a desire surfaces into awareness, it has already won the internal competition, already defeated all the other potential desires that might have directed behaviour differently, and the person experiencing this desire believes they are choosing to pursue it when really they are simply being moved by it, the way a leaf is moved by wind. This philosophy emerges from Schopenhauer's reading of Kant, who had argued that free will might exist in the noumenal realm, in the world of things in themselves, beyond the reach of scientific inquiry. But Schopenhauer looked at the world of appearance, the world of bodies and brains and observable behaviour, and saw only necessity, only the playing out of character and circumstance, only the illusion of freedom in beings who are as determined as everything else in nature. The modern neuroscience of decision-making has only deepened these intuitions, has added layer upon layer of empirical evidence that conscious intention is not the prime mover it feels like from the inside, that decisions emerge from a complex interplay of neural systems, some of which operate entirely outside of awareness, some of which can be influenced by factors the conscious mind would never acknowledge as relevant. Studies show that exposure to certain words, even words flashed too quickly to be consciously perceived, can alter subsequent choices, can make people more likely to select one product over another, one action over another, without any sense that they have been influenced. Other research demonstrates that neural activity patterns can predict decisions up to 10 seconds before the person reports being aware of having made a choice, which stretches the Libet finding into even more troubling territory, because 10 seconds is not a brief delay, not a minor gap, but a vast expanse of time in which the brain is already committed, already moving toward an outcome, while consciousness remains completely in the dark, generating the experience of openness, of possibility, of standing at a crossroads when the turn has already been made. The philosopher Daniel Wegner spent years studying the experience of willing, the feeling of authorship that accompanies voluntary action, and he concluded that this feeling is itself a construction, a post hoc inference that the brain generates based on certain cues, the temporal proximity of thought and action, the consistency between intention and outcome, the absence of obvious external causes, and when these cues are present, people feel they cause their actions. But when the cues are manipulated, when thoughts are planted or outcomes are rigged, people will claim authorship of actions they did not perform or deny authorship of actions they did, which suggests that the sense of agency is not a direct readout of causal reality, but a story the brain tells, a useful fiction that helps organize experience but should not be mistaken for truth. Free will skeptics argue that this evidence is overwhelming, that the case is closed, that continuing to believe in libertarian free will, in the kind of freedom that says people could genuinely have done otherwise in identical circumstances, is like continuing to believe in phlogiston or the ether, clinging to a concept that science has rendered obsolete. But the defenders of free will have not surrendered. They have regrouped and refined their positions, distinguishing between different types of freedom, arguing that even if the brain initiates actions before consciousness knows about them, even if every neural event is caused by prior neural events, there is still a meaningful sense in which people are free, a sense that matters for ethics and law and the texture of human life. The compatibilists, the philosophers who believe that free will and determinism can coexist, argue that freedom has never been about escaping causation, but about the right kind of causation, that an action is free if it flows from the person's own desires, beliefs, and values, even if those desires and beliefs and values are themselves the product of genetics and environment, and all the accidents of biography, because what matters is not whether the decision could have been different in some absolute metaphysical sense, but whether it reflects the person's nature, whether it is truly theirs. Daniel Dennett, perhaps the most prominent contemporary compatibilist, argues that the kind of free will worth wanting is not the impossible libertarian version, not the magic ability to be an uncaused cause, but the practical ability to deliberate, to respond to reasons, to adjust behavior based on reflection and learning. And this kind of freedom, he insists, is not only compatible with determinism, but depends on it, because if actions were truly random, truly uncaused, they would not be free but chaotic, not expressions of will, but meaningless noise. The debate between free will skeptics and compatibilists often comes down to definitions, to what the word freedom should mean, whether it should track the folk intuitions that most people have, the feeling that they could have done otherwise, or whether it should be reformed, redefined to fit what science reveals about how decisions actually work. And there is something unsatisfying about this, something that feels like changing the subject, because when someone asks whether they are free, whether their choices are real, they are not usually asking whether their actions flow from their character. They are asking something deeper, something harder. They are asking whether they are the ultimate source of their actions, whether the buck stops with them, or whether they too are just part of the causal chain, effects masquerading as causes. The philosopher Galen Strawson has pressed this point with particular force, arguing that to be truly responsible for an action, a person would need to be responsible for the way they are, for their character and values and decision-making processes. But to be responsible for the way they are, they would need to have chosen to be that way. And to have chosen to be that way, they would need to already be a certain way, which means they would need to have chosen that prior way of being. And this regress continues backward infinitely, which means that ultimate self-creation is impossible, that no one can be the author of themselves in the deep sense that true moral responsibility seems to require. Strawson calls this the impossibility of ultimate responsibility, and he argues that once this is understood, really understood, not just acknowledged intellectually, but grasped emotionally, the ground shifts beneath ethics, beneath praise and blame, beneath the entire structure of desert. Because how can someone deserve punishment for actions that ultimately trace back to factors they did not control, to the genes they inherited, the neurons they were born with, the environments that shaped them before they had any capacity to resist? This is where the philosophy becomes dangerous, where it starts to have implications that extend beyond seminar rooms and into courtrooms, into everyday judgments about character and culpability. Because if determinism is true, if free will is illusion, then what justifies holding anyone responsible for anything? What grounds the anger at wrongdoing, the gratitude for kindness, the entire emotional economy of human social life? Some philosophers argue that nothing changes, that even if people are not free in the ultimate sense, society still needs laws and sanctions, still needs to modify behavior through consequences, and understanding that criminals are determined does not mean releasing them. It just means rethinking the rationale for punishment, shifting from a retribution to deterrence and rehabilitation, from giving people what they deserve to protecting society and helping people change. But others worry that this is too optimistic, that without the belief in free will, without the sense that people are genuine agents who could have chosen differently, something essential will drain out of human relationships. Some texture of respect and indignation and moral seriousness will be lost, and what remains will be a world of causes and effects, of mechanisms and interventions, where no one is truly seen, where everyone is reduced to a collection of processes that could not have been otherwise. The experimental philosopher Sean Nichols has studied how people actually respond when confronted with deterministic scenarios, and the results are complicated, context-dependent, resistant to simple summary, because human intuitions about free will are not consistent. People are libertarians about some cases and compatibilists about others, and the factors that drive these shifts are often subtle, influenced by emotional content, by whether the action in question is abstract or visceral, by whether the person is thinking about themselves or someone else. When people imagine a deterministic universe in the abstract, a universe where every event is caused by prior events according to natural laws, many of them conclude that in such a universe, no one would be truly responsible, that moral responsibility requires the possibility of doing otherwise. But when people are given concrete cases, asked whether someone who deliberates carefully and acts according to their values is responsible, many of them say yes, even if they are told that the person's values and deliberation processes are themselves determined, which suggests that something about the details of agency, about the phenomenology of decision-making, exerts a pull on judgment that abstract metaphysics cannot overcome. This might mean that free will is an ineliminable feature of human self-understanding, something wired so deeply into the architecture of social cognition that no amount of scientific evidence can dislodge it. Or it might mean that people have not yet fully confronted what determinism entails, that they are holding contradictory beliefs, without noticing the contradiction, and that a more thorough education in neuroscience and philosophy would eventually shift intuitions toward a more consistent skepticism about agency. Nietzsche saw this tension, saw how the belief in free will serves certain psychological and social functions regardless of its truth, and he argued that the concept of free will was invented to make people feel guilty, to make them believe they could have acted differently and therefore deserve punishment when they act badly, and he traced this invention to the priests and moralists who needed people to feel responsible in order to control them, to make them internalize standards of behavior, to turn outward judgment into inward shame. Nietzsche believed that the free will debate was less about metaphysics and more about power, about who gets to define the terms of responsibility, who benefits from the belief that actions are freely chosen versus the belief that they are determined. And he advocated for a philosophy beyond good and evil, beyond the framework of moral responsibility altogether, where actions would be evaluated not on whether they were freely chosen, but on whether they affirmed life, whether they expressed strength or weakness, whether they moved toward flourishing or decay. But this philosophy never gained mainstream acceptance, in part because it seems to provide no basis for justice, no way to respond to harm except through power, through the strong imposing their will on the weak. And most people, even most philosophers, recoil from this vision, preferring to preserve some notion of desert, some sense that moral evaluation tracks something real about persons and their choices. The question of whether free will exists might be the wrong question, or at least an incomplete question, because what people are really asking is whether the life they are living has the meaning they thought it had, whether their efforts matter, whether the future is genuinely open or already written. And these questions do not have purely intellectual answers. They have existential weight. They shape how people move through the world, how they treat themselves and others, how they bear suffering and celebrate success. If someone believes they are free, truly free, they might approach failure with harsher self-judgment, might conclude that suffering is their fault, their choice, evidence of moral weakness, but they might also approach success with greater pride, might feel that their achievements are truly theirs, earned rather than given, and this can be motivating, can drive people to push harder, to resist circumstances, to believe that trying matters because outcomes are not yet fixed. But if someone believes they are determined, that everything was always going to be this way, they might find relief in that, might let go of the burden of self-blame, might extend more compassion to themselves and others, recognizing that everyone is doing the best they can given the hand they were dealt, the brain they were born with, the world that shaped them. But they might also sink into passivity, into the feeling that effort is pointless, that nothing they do will change the outcome. And this can be paralyzing, can drain the motivation that makes life livable. The psychologist Roy Baumeister has conducted research suggesting that believing in free will, whether or not it is true, has practical benefits. That people who score higher on free will belief scales are more likely to help others, less likely to cheat, more willing to exert effort, more persistent in the face of difficulty. And when people are experimentally induced to disbelieve in free will, when they're exposed to deterministic messaging before performing tasks, they tend to behave more selfishly, more aggressively, as if the belief that they are not in control licenses them to act without restraint, to give in to impulses they would normally resist. But other researchers have challenged these findings, have argued that the effects are small and inconsistent, that they depend heavily on how free will disbelief is framed, and that it is possible to disbelieve in libertarian free will without abandoning moral responsibility, without losing motivation, without descending into nihilism. Because the kind of freedom that matters, the kind that grounds ethics and meaning, does not require metaphysical impossibilities, does not require being an uncaused cause, but only requires being the kind of creature that can reflect on reasons, that can learn and change, that can align actions with values, even if those values are themselves caused. The challenge is conveying this, making it feel real, because the folk intuition of free will is libertarian, is the sense that, at the moment of decision, the future is genuinely open, that there are multiple possible paths forward and the choice selects among them. And this intuition is persistent, visceral, difficult to shake even for philosophers who intellectually accept determinism, who can argue persuasively that libertarian free will is incoherent but still feel, in the moment of deliberation, that they are choosing, that it matters what they do, that the outcome is not yet settled. The philosopher William James called this the dilemma of determinism, recognized that both horns of the problem draw blood, that accepting determinism seems to drain significance from choice, while rejecting it seems to require embracing metaphysical mysteries that sit uneasily with scientific understanding. And James himself oscillated between positions, sometimes defending the reality of chance, of genuine openness in the universe, sometimes acknowledging that determinism might be true, but insisting that the belief in freedom is necessary for moral strenuousness, for the feeling that life is worth living with full intensity. James understood that philosophy is not always about finding truth in some abstract sense, but about finding beliefs that allow humans to function, to thrive, to maintain the sense that their lives matter. And he suggested that the question of free will might be one of those questions where truth takes a back seat to utility, where what matters is not whether libertarian freedom exists in the metaphysical machinery of the cosmos, but whether believing in it makes people better, more engaged, more fully human. But this pragmatic approach has its own dangers, its own ways of collapsing into cynicism. Because if belief in free will is just a useful fiction, if it is something to be maintained for instrumental reasons rather than because it tracks reality, then the belief becomes vulnerable, fragile, something that sophisticated people see through. And once seen through, it loses its power, becomes a lie that no longer convinces. And the question becomes whether there is a stable middle ground, a way of understanding agency that neither requires libertarian magic nor reduces human beings to mechanisms that merely process inputs into outputs without any meaningful sense of self-determination. The concept of emergence offers one possible middle ground, suggests that even if every neuron obeys deterministic laws, even if every firing is caused by prior firings according to physical necessity, the patterns that emerge at higher levels of organization might have properties that cannot be reduced to the behavior of individual components. That a person is not just a collection of neurons, but a dynamic system whose behavior exhibits genuine complexity, genuine unpredictability from the inside, even if it is, in principle, predictable from the outside with perfect information. The emergence theorists argue that consciousness itself is an emergent property, something that arises from the interaction of billions of neurons, but cannot be found in any individual neuron. And perhaps agency is similar, perhaps the capacity to act for reasons, to integrate information across time, to model possible futures and select actions based on evaluations of those futures, is real and causally efficacious, even if it supervenes on physical processes that are themselves determined. Because the level of description matters, because saying that a person chose to do something and saying that their neurons fired in a particular pattern are not competing explanations, but complementary descriptions of the same event at different scales, and both can be true simultaneously. This view tries to preserve what matters about free will, the sense that persons are genuine causal agents whose deliberations make a difference, while acknowledging that this agency does not require violating physical law, does not require being uncaused. But the skeptics remain unconvinced, argue that emergence does not solve the problem, but merely restates it, because even if consciousness and agency are emergent properties, they are still properties of a physical system that is causally closed, that operates according to deterministic principles. And so the higher-level descriptions, the talk of reasons and choices and values, might be useful for prediction and understanding, but they do not change the underlying reality, which is that every thought, every decision, every moment of deliberation was fixed by the prior state of the universe, plus the laws of nature, and calling this agency does not make it free in any robust sense. The philosopher Derek Parfit explored a related puzzle through thought experiments about personal identity, asking what makes someone the same person over time, what grounds the sense of being a continuous self, and his conclusion was that personal identity is not what matters, that what matters is psychological continuity, the smooth flow of memories and intentions and character traits from one moment to the next. And even if this continuity is interrupted, even if someone undergoes radical change or is split into multiple beings in some science fiction scenario, the question of whether they survive is less important than the question of whether the psychological connections are preserved. Parfit's work has implications for free will because it challenges the notion of a stable, unified agent, Sartre, who stands behind actions and chooses them, suggests instead that the self is a process, a series of overlapping stages connected by memory and intention, but not governed by any central controller, any homunculus sitting in the brain pulling levers. And if there is no central controller, if the self is really just a convenient fiction, a narrative overlay on a massively parallel distributed system, then the question of whether the self is free becomes strangely empty, because there is no self in the required sense, no entity that could be either free or unfree, just patterns of activation, just processes unfolding. This view is sometimes called illusionism, the position that consciousness and selfhood and agency are all illusions in a specific sense, not that they do not exist as experiences, but that the experiences systematically misrepresent their own nature, that they feel like something they are not, that the unity and control and freedom that seem so obvious from the inside are artifacts of how information is processed rather than accurate maps of underlying reality. Buddhism reached similar conclusions 25 centuries ago without the benefit of neuroscience, through meditation and introspection, through careful attention to the arising and passing of mental states. And the core teaching of anatta, of no self, holds that the sense of being a permanent, independent agent is a delusion, that what people call the self is really just a collection of aggregates, body and feeling and perception, and mental formations and consciousness. And these aggregates are constantly changing, constantly conditioned by other factors, never stable, never autonomous, never in control in the way that the folk concept of self implies. Buddhist practice aims to see through this delusion, to experience directly the constructed nature of the self. And the promise is that this insight brings liberation. Not the libertarian freedom to choose otherwise, but the freedom from suffering that comes from recognizing that there is no one to be blamed or praised, no permanent self that needs to be defended or improved, just the flowing of experience according to causes and conditions. And this flowing can be wise or unwise, can lead toward or away from suffering, but it is not chosen by an agent, because there is no agent separate from the flow. The Western philosophers who encounter Buddhism often struggle with it, find it hard to reconcile with the ethical frameworks built into European thought, because Western ethics, since the Greeks has been agent-centered, has assumed that persons are the locus of value and responsibility, that moral evaluation applies to individuals who persist through time and can be held accountable for their choices. But Buddhism seems to dissolve the agent, to remove the foundation on which praise and blame rest, and the question becomes what ethics looks like in a framework without selves, whether compassion and wisdom can be cultivated without assuming an agent who cultivates them, whether the path can be walked by someone who knows there is no walker. The Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, offered a different approach to the free will problem, one that accepts determinism fully, embraces the idea that everything happens according to fate, that the universe is a rational whole governed by logos, by divine reason that arranges everything for the best, and yet insists that human beings are still free in the only way that matters, free to assent or refuse assent to impressions, free to maintain the correct attitudes toward events, even if the events themselves are not within their control. Epictetus distinguished between what is up to us and what is not up to us, argued that the only thing truly up to us is our judgments, our opinions about events, our inner dispositions, and that everything external, health, wealth, reputation, even the body itself, is not up to us, is part of the larger causal order that we cannot alter, and true freedom consists in recognizing this distinction and investing all concern in what is actually within the sphere of control, while maintaining indifference toward everything else, neither desiring what is not up to us nor fearing its loss. This might seem like a redefinition of freedom, a moving of the goalposts, but the Stoics believed they were identifying what freedom really is, had always been, that the common error is to think freedom means getting what you want, shaping external circumstances to match preferences, when really, freedom means wanting only what you already have power over, aligning the will with necessity so completely that there is no gap between what happens and what is willed. And in that alignment, in that perfect acceptance, there is a kind of invulnerability, because nothing can be taken away that was never possessed, nothing can disappoint expectations that were never formed. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations that a person should be like a rock against which the waves crash. The rock stands firm, and the churning waters around it fall still, and this image captures the Stoic attitude toward determinism, the sense that even though everything is fated, even though nothing happens except what was always going to happen, there is still a quality of response, a manner of bearing what cannot be changed. And this manner is not itself fated in the same way, or rather, it is fated, but it feels like freedom because it is the expression of reason, of the divine spark within that aligns itself with the divine order without. And this alignment is experienced as peace, as the cessation of the internal struggle against reality that characterizes most human suffering. The Stoic position is attractive to many people, even today, especially those who find themselves in circumstances they cannot control, facing illness or loss or systemic injustice, because it offers a way to maintain dignity and agency in the face of powerlessness. A way to say that even though the external world is not up to me, my response to it is, my character is, the way I hold myself in the storm is, but critics argue that this is cold comfort, that it requires giving up too much, that caring only about internal states and not about outcomes in the world is a kind of defeat, a retreat from engagement, from the fight to make things better, and that real freedom, if it exists at all, must involve some capacity to affect the external world, to change circumstances and not just attitudes towards circumstances. The French existentialists, particularly Jean-Paul Sartre, took the opposite approach, argued that human beings are radically free, that existence precedes essence, that there is no fixed human nature, no predetermined path, that each person is thrown into the world and must create themselves through their choices. And this freedom is not a gift, but a burden, a source of anguish, because it means that no one can escape responsibility. No one can blame their nature or their circumstances or their past for what they do now, because at every moment the future is open and the person must choose without guidance from any essence or nature or divine plan. Sartre's philosophy is in many ways a reaction to determinism, an insistence that even if the physical world is causally closed, even if neurons fire according to natural law, there is still something about consciousness, something about the for itself as opposed to the in itself, that introduces a gap, a nothingness, a space where determination breaks down and genuine choice becomes possible. But Sartre never explained how this works, never provided a mechanism, never showed how consciousness could violate or escape physical causation, and so his position remains more a declaration than an argument, more a stance than a theory, and critics see it as wishful thinking, as the philosophical equivalent of stomping one's foot and insisting that freedom must be real because life would be unbearable otherwise. But Sartre might respond that this misses the point, that the freedom he describes is not a metaphysical claim about causation, but a phenomenological description of what it is like to be conscious, to face the future, to deliberate. And from that first-person perspective, determinism is not just false but meaningless, because the experience of deliberation necessarily involves the sense that multiple options are available, that the outcome is not yet settled, and to deliberate while believing the outcome is already determined is to engage in a kind of performative contradiction, is to act as if something is true while believing it is false. And maybe this contradiction reveals something important. Maybe it shows that determinism, even if true from the third-person scientific perspective, cannot be integrated into first-person practical reasoning without causing cognitive dissonance or motivational collapse. Thomas Nagel has written extensively about this gap between perspectives, between the subjective and objective views, and he argues that some truths look different depending on which standpoint is adopted, that the view from nowhere, the perspective of science that tries to describe reality without any particular point of view, inevitably leaves out something about what it's like to be a conscious agent. And the view from somewhere, the perspective of lived experience, cannot fully capture the causal structure that science reveals. Nagel believes that both perspectives are valid, that neither can be reduced to the other, and that the problem of free will arises from trying to reconcile them, from trying to make the objective truth that decisions are determined by prior causes compatible with the subjective experience, that decisions are open and chosen, and perhaps this reconciliation is impossible. Perhaps the best that can be done is to acknowledge the tension, to live with the ambiguity, to use the deterministic perspective for certain purposes, for prediction and explanation and understanding, while using the agential perspective for other purposes, for planning and ethics and self-understanding, and to resist the demand for a single unified story that makes both perspectives fit together seamlessly. This might seem like an intellectually unsatisfying position, like giving up on the philosophical task of finding coherence, but Nagel would argue that the demand for coherence might be misplaced, that reality itself might be fundamentally paradoxical when viewed from different angles, that the mistake is not in the failure to resolve the paradox, but in expecting it to be resolvable. The debate over free will has practical consequences that extend into legal systems, into how societies punish criminals and assign responsibility, and the tension is particularly visible in cases involving brain damage or mental illness, where the intuition that someone is responsible for their actions clashes with evidence that their behaviour was caused by factors beyond their control. Neuroscientists can now point to specific brain regions, specific patterns of activation or damage that correlate with violent behaviour, with impulsivity, with the inability to regulate emotion. And as this knowledge accumulates, the question becomes whether these findings should change how justice is administered, whether someone whose prefrontal cortex is compromised should be held to the same standard of responsibility as someone whose brain is functioning normally, and if not, where the line is drawn, because every brain is shaped by factors outside its control. Every pattern of neural activity is caused by genetics and environment and the cascade of prior events. And if brain damage excuses behaviour, then why doesn't ordinary causation excuse it? What is the principal difference between saying this person is not responsible because of a tumour and saying no one is responsible because everything is caused? Some legal theorists, like Stephen Morse, argue that the law already operates on a compatibilist framework, that the legal concept of responsibility does not require libertarian free will, but only requires that the person was rational at the time of the act, capable of understanding what they were doing, and conforming their behavior to the law, and that most neuroscience findings are irrelevant to this standard because they do not show that the person lacked rationality. They just show that the person's rationality was caused, which is true of everyone's rationality, and thus not exculpatory. Other theorists like Joshua Green and Jonathan Cohen argue that as neuroscience advances, as the public becomes more educated about how the brain works, intuitions about responsibility will shift, that people will begin to see criminal behavior the way they currently see disease, as something to be managed and treated rather than punished, and that this shift will ultimately be for the best, will lead to a more humane and effective justice system that focuses on preventing harm rather than inflicting suffering on those who cause it. But critics worry that this medicalization of crime will erode the dignity of persons, will treat human beings as broken machines to be repaired rather than as agents who can be addressed through reasons, who can be called upon to justify themselves, who participate in the moral community as equals rather than as patients or objects of intervention. And there is something troubling about the image of a world where no one is blamed because everyone is understood to be determined, where every action is met with sympathy or strategic intervention, but never with anger or condemnation, because anger and condemnation are how communities affirm standards, how they communicate that certain behaviours are unacceptable, and without that communication, without the emotional force that accompanies it, the standards might lose their grip, might become merely pragmatic rules rather than moral boundaries that command respect. The philosopher P.F. Strawson argued that the reactive attitudes, the emotions like resentment and gratitude and guilt that structure human relationships, are so deeply woven into the fabric of social life that they cannot be given up, even if determinism is true. That to view someone from the objective stance, to see them as merely caused, is to withdraw from relationship with them, to treat them as a thing rather than a person. And while this stance is sometimes necessary in cases of severe mental illness or very young children, it cannot become the default without destroying something essential about human community. And so, even if determinism is true, even if libertarian free will is an illusion, people will continue to hold each other responsible, will continue to feel the reactive attitudes, because these are not optional additions to social life, but constitutive of it. Not beliefs that can be revised in light of evidence, but structures that make evidence and revision possible in the first place. The question of free will also intersects with the experience of addiction, where the sense of being not in control becomes acute, where people report wanting to stop and being unable to stop, where the gap between desire and action opens up in painful clarity. And this has led some researchers to see addiction as a natural experiment in the limits of agency, a case where the deterministic processes underlying behaviour become visible, where the usual sense of freedom breaks down, and what remains is craving and habit, and the mechanical repetition of actions that the person knows are harmful but cannot seem to prevent. Gene Heyman, in his work on addiction, argues that addicts are not as powerless as they often believe, that even heavy drug users respond to incentives, modify their behaviour when the consequences become severe enough, quit when they age out, or find new sources of meaning, and that the disease model of addiction, while well-intentioned, actually undermines recovery by encouraging people to see themselves as victims of a condition rather than as agents who can change. But others respond that this misses the phenomenology of addiction, the experience of being genuinely unable to resist despite wanting to, despite knowing better, despite every rational consideration pointing towards stopping, and that this experience reveals something true about human agency more generally, that the sense of control is often illusory, that willpower is not a stable resource that can be called upon at will, but a variable that depends on neurotransmitter levels, sleep, stress, blood sugar, and countless other factors that are not themselves under voluntary control. And so the addict is not an exception to the rule of agency, but an exaggeration of it. A clearer display of the truth that all behaviour is caused, all choices are constrained, all freedom is conditional on factors that no one chooses. The tension between determinism and moral responsibility reaches its most acute form in the question of punishment, in the practice of making people suffer for what they have done, and the traditional justification for punishment has always been retributive, has always rested on the idea that wrongdoers deserve to suffer, that justice requires balancing the scales, that there is something right and proper about inflicting harm on those who have inflicted harm, independent of any practical benefits that might flow from it. But if determinism is true, if the wrongdoer could not have done otherwise given the state of their brain and the circumstances they faced, then what grounds this desert? What makes it just rather than merely cruel to add suffering, to punish someone for being the kind of person that the universe made them? The retributive impulse runs deep, deeper than philosophy, deeper than argument. It appears in children before they can articulate reasons, appears across cultures with remarkable consistency, appears to be wired into the emotional architecture of human beings as a response to perceived unfairness, and evolutionary psychologists explain this by pointing to the adaptive value of punishment in maintaining cooperation, in deterring free riding, in enforcing norms that benefit the group even when they require individual sacrifice. But the fact that the impulse is natural does not make it justified, does not mean that acting on it is right, because many natural impulses, many emotional responses that were adaptive in ancestral environments are now recognized as requiring regulation, as needing to be constrained by reason and reflection. And perhaps the desire to punish is one of these. Perhaps it is a vestige of a less reflective time, a time when humans did not understand causation, did not see the long chains of cause and effect that produce behavior, and attributed actions to a freely choosing self that could have done otherwise, and therefore deserves what it gets. The consequentialist approach to punishment avoids these metaphysical tangles by justifying punishment not in terms of desert, but in terms of outcomes, arguing that punishment is acceptable when it reduces future harm through deterrence, incapacitation, or rehabilitation, when it protects potential victims by making would-be wrongdoers think twice, or by removing dangerous individuals from society, or by helping offenders change in ways that make them less likely to reoffend. And this approach does not require believing in libertarian free will, does not require thinking that the offender could have done otherwise. It only requires believing that punishment can alter future behaviour, that consequences affect decisions, that even determined beings respond to incentives. But critics point out that consequentialist justifications for punishment can lead to troubling conclusions, can justify punishing the innocent if doing so would have good consequences, can justify excessive punishment if the deterrent effect is strong enough, can justify treating persons as mere means to social ends rather than as beings with inherent dignity. And so consequentialism about punishment, while avoiding the free will problem, introduces other problems, other ways in which the practice of deliberately inflicting suffering on human beings seems to require more justification than utility alone can provide. The philosopher John Rawls tried to combine retributive and consequentialist elements, arguing that punishment as an institution is justified by its beneficial consequences, but that within that institution, punishment should only be applied to the guilty and should be proportionate to the offence, which preserves the intuition that desert matters, while acknowledging that the practice as a whole needs pragmatic justification. But this hybrid approach has its own tensions, its own ways in which the two elements pull against each other, because if the justification is really consequentialist at the foundational level, then the constraints about guilt and proportionality are secondary, are rules of thumb that generally promote good consequences, but could be overridden when they do not. And if the constraints are really absolute, really non-negotiable, then they seem to require some notion of desert, some idea that people deserve punishment independent of consequences, which brings back the free will problem. Dirk Beerbohm, one of the most prominent contemporary free will skeptics, argues that punishment cannot be justified on retributive grounds, once libertarian free will is rejected. That desert-based punishment is simply incompatible with the recognition that offenders are determined. But he does not conclude that society should give up on responding to crime. Instead, he proposes what he calls the public health quarantine model, which justifies incarceration the way quarantine is justified, not as something the person deserves, but as a necessary measure to protect others, a measure that should be as humane as possible, as limited in duration as possible, focused entirely on prevention rather than on making the offender suffer. And this model would transform criminal justice, would eliminate much of the harshness and vindictiveness that characterizes current systems, would lead to shorter sentences, better conditions, more emphasis on helping offenders rather than punishing them. But critics argue that this model still involves depriving people of liberty, still involves coercion, and without some notion that the person has forfeited their right to liberty through their actions. Without some idea of desert, it is hard to see why this deprivation is justified, why the offender specifically should bear the cost of protecting others rather than the cost being distributed across society. And Beerbohm's response is that the offender does not deserve to be incarcerated, but that incarceration is the least harmful way to prevent serious threats. That just as someone with a dangerous, contagious disease can be quarantined without having done anything wrong, without deserving the restriction, someone who is disposed to commit violence can be temporarily segregated. But the analogy is imperfect because disease is not action, is not the kind of thing that calls for moral response, and treating crime like disease seems to miss something about agency, about the difference between being sick and doing wrong. The philosopher Daniel Dennett has suggested that much of the free will debate is a confusion, that people are asking the wrong questions, that the issue is not whether some metaphysically exotic form of freedom exists, but whether human beings have the kind of practical competence that grounds moral responsibility, the ability to respond to reasons, to learn from experience, to adjust behaviour based on feedback. And this kind of competence is perfectly compatible with determinism, is in fact enhanced by determinism. Because if actions were truly random, then they would not be responsive to reasons, would not be the kind of thing that could be shaped by argument or evidence or reflection. And so the freedom worth wanting is not freedom from causation, but freedom from certain kinds of constraints. Freedom from coercion, freedom from ignorance, freedom from compulsion. And these freedoms are real, are achievable, are what distinguish responsible agents from those who are not responsible. And once this is understood, once the metaphysical baggage is dropped, the practical question becomes clearer, becomes a question about what kind of capacities someone needs to have in order to be an appropriate target of moral evaluation. And most adults most of the time have these capacities. And so most of the time, moral evaluation is appropriate. Praise and blame make sense. Responsibility is real, not because people could have done otherwise in some ultimate sense, but because they are the kind of beings whose behaviour is sensitive to moral considerations, who can be reached through dialogue, who participate in the moral community as recognisers and recognised. But Dennett's critics argue that this relocates rather than solves the problem, because the capacities he points to, the ability to respond to reasons and learn from experience, are themselves the products of genetics and environment, are themselves determined. And so if someone lacks these capacities, if they were never able to develop them because of how their brain was formed, then on Dennett's account they are not responsible. But this seems arbitrary, seems to be drawing a line between those who got lucky in the genetic and environmental lottery and those who did not, and calling the lucky ones responsible while excusing the unlucky ones, without acknowledging that the luck extends all the way down, that no one is responsible for having the capacities that ground responsibility. Immanuel Kant believed that morality requires freedom. That ought implies can, that it makes no sense to say someone ought to do something if they cannot do it. And if determinism is true, then in some sense no one can do anything other than what they actually do, which means that moral obligations are impossible, that the entire structure of duty and virtue collapses. But Kant also believed that determinism applies only to the phenomenal world, the world as it appears to human cognition, structured by space and time and causality, while the noumenal world, the world of things in themselves, is not bound by these categories, and human beings, as both phenomenal and noumenal, are determined in their appearances but free in their essence, free in the part of them that is not accessible to empirical investigation. And this allows Kant to preserve both the truth of science, which requires determinism, and the truth of morality, which requires freedom. But the cost is high, because the freedom that matters, the freedom that grounds moral responsibility, is placed permanently beyond the reach of evidence, becomes a postulate of practical reason rather than a discoverable fact, something that must be believed in order for morality to make sense even though it cannot be known. And many philosophers find this unsatisfying, find it suspiciously convenient, a way of protecting a cherished belief from empirical challenge by placing it in a realm where challenge is impossible. And the question becomes whether freedom is really preserved if it is relegated to the noumenal, whether a freedom that never appears, that has no manifestation in the world of experience, is a freedom worth having, or just a verbal maneuver that leaves everything as it was. Schopenhauer, who began as a follower of Kant, ultimately rejected the noumenal freedom, argued that the will is one, is the thing in itself, but that it is blind, striving without purpose or choice, and that individual human beings are manifestations of this universal will, are not separate agents with libertarian freedom, but localized expressions of a single force that moves through all of nature. And from this perspective, the question of whether a person could have acted differently becomes absurd, because the person is not really separate from the universal will, is not an independent locus of agency, but a wave in an ocean, a temporary pattern in an eternal flow. And the sense of being a distinct self with free choice is the fundamental illusion. The illusion that causes suffering because it leads to attachment, to the belief that outcomes matter, that getting what one wants will bring satisfaction, when really satisfaction is impossible because desire is endless, because the will never rests, and the only escape from suffering is to see through the illusion, to recognize that the self is not what it appears to be, that its desires are not its own, but are imposed by the will, and to withdraw assent from these desires, to stop identifying with them, to achieve a kind of resignation that is close to the Buddhist nirvana, close to the cessation of striving. And in this cessation, there is peace. Not the peace of getting what one wants, but the peace of no longer wanting, of seeing that the entire game of seeking and acquiring and achieving was always driven by forces that had nothing to do with the apparent agent, that used the agent as a vehicle for their own blind purposes. The existentialists recoiled from this pessimism, from this vision of human beings as puppets of cosmic will, and insisted that even if metaphysical freedom is impossible, even if libertarian choice is incoherent, there is still a kind of freedom that matters, a freedom that consists in taking responsibility, in owning one's actions, in refusing to hide behind excuses or deterministic explanations. And Sartre's famous claim that man is condemned to be free, that existence precedes essence, means that there is no script, no nature, no predetermined path, that each person must create themselves through their choices, and cannot appeal to any external authority or fixed nature to justify those choices, because there is no such authority, no such nature. There is only the radical contingency of existence, the fact of being thrown into a world without instruction manual. And this is freedom not as a metaphysical property, but as an existential condition, as the inescapability of choice, because even refusing to choose is a choice, even letting others decide is a decision, and so there is no escape from responsibility, no refuge in determinism, because to say that one's actions are determined is already to take a stance, to interpret oneself in a particular way, and that interpretation is itself not determined in the sense of being forced, is itself chosen. And so the existentialist moves in circles, insisting on freedom while acknowledging causation, and the circles are not vicious but productive, are the structure of authentic existence, of taking up one's facticity, one's thrownness, and making something of it, not in the sense of escaping it, but in the sense of affirming it, of saying yes to the situation one finds oneself in, and acting from within it rather than wishing for some other situation, some other set of possibilities. But this existentialist freedom is thin, is more an attitude than a capacity, more a way of bearing necessity than a power to alter it. And it is not clear that it deserves the name freedom, not clear that it is anything more than a rhetorical flourish designed to salvage dignity in the face of powerlessness. Harry Frankfurt offers yet another approach, argues that freedom of will does not require the ability to do otherwise, that what matters is not whether one could have chosen differently, but whether one's choice reflects one's will, and more specifically, whether it reflects one's second-order desires, one's desires about desires, because human beings are unique in their capacity to reflect on their motivations, to want to be motivated by certain desires rather than others, to identify with some impulses and repudiate others, and a person is free on Frankfurt's account, when their actions flow from desires they endorse, when there is no conflict between what they want and what they want to want, no sense of being driven by impulses they wish they did not have. And this kind of freedom is compatible with determinism because it does not require alternative possibilities, does not require that things could have been different. It only requires a certain kind of internal harmony, a certain alignment between levels of motivation. But Frankfurt's theory has been criticized for not going deep enough, for not asking whether the second-order desires themselves are chosen, whether the capacity to identify with certain first-order desires is itself something the person controls. And if not, if the second-order desires are as determined as the first-order desires, then the harmony Frankfurt describes might be nothing more than the absence of internal conflict, nothing more than the fortunate circumstance of having compatible layers of motivation. And calling this freedom seems to be using the word in a way that does not capture what people care about when they ask whether they are free, because what they care about is not just internal consistency, but the sense of being the ultimate source, the sense that the buck stops here. And Frankfurt's theory, like all compatibilist theories, seems to push that question back without answering it. The neuroscientist Sam Harris has argued that the compatibilist theories are not just wrong, but dishonest, that they are trying to salvage a word, trying to preserve the language of free will and responsibility, while gutting the concepts of their actual content. Because when ordinary people say they believe in free will, they do not mean that their actions flow from their character, or their second-order desires, or their reasons-responsive capacities. They mean that they could have done otherwise, that at the moment of choice the future was genuinely open. And once it is explained that this kind of freedom does not exist, that neuroscience shows decisions are made before consciousness is aware of them, that every thought and intention is the product of prior causes that stretch back to genetics and childhood and beyond. Most people experience this as a loss, as the removal of something they believed they had, and the compatibilist comes along and says that nothing has been lost, that the kind of freedom they thought they had was never coherent, was never worth wanting, but this feels like gaslighting, like being told that the thing you lost was not real in the first place, and so you should not miss it. And Harris believes that the honest response is to acknowledge the loss, to admit that libertarian free will does not exist and that this changes things, changes how we think about ourselves and each other, changes the emotional texture of praise and blame, changes the justification for punishment, and that trying to preserve the old language, the old concepts, is a way of avoiding these changes, of wanting to have scientific knowledge without accepting its implications. The psychologist Paul Bloom, in contrast, argues that believing in free will is not a mistake but a deep feature of human cognition, something that develops early, that appears to be universal across cultures, that serves important functions in making sense of behaviour and organising social life, and that scientific findings about determinism, even if true, should not and probably cannot dislodge this belief, because it is not really a belief in the sense of a hypothesis that responds to evidence, but is more like a framework, a way of structuring experience, a lens through which social behaviour is interpreted. And removing this lens would not reveal reality more clearly, but would make certain kinds of understanding impossible, certain kinds of human relationship unnavigable, because the stance of holding someone responsible, of engaging with them as a rational agent who can justify their actions and be called to account, requires treating them as if they are free, as if their choices are really theirs. And this, as if, is not a lie, but a practical necessity, a stance that cannot be abandoned without abandoning the form of life that makes humans human. And so the debate about whether free will exists is less important than the debate about whether the concept of free will is indispensable, whether it can be eliminated from human thought and practice without catastrophic loss. And Bloom suggests that it cannot, that a world without free will belief would be a world where people treat each other as objects to be managed, rather than as subjects to be engaged, and that this would be a genuine impoverishment, a flattening of the moral landscape, regardless of whether free will in the metaphysical sense exists or not. The question of whether choice is real ultimately returns to the question of what real means. What criteria must be satisfied for something to count as genuine rather than illusory? And the answer depends on metaphysical commitments that run deeper than evidence, that shape how evidence is interpreted. What counts as explanation? What demands justification? And what can be taken as basic? And these commitments are not themselves chosen, are not the product of free deliberation, but are absorbed from culture, from education, from the accidents of which books were encountered at which moments, from the structure of the language spoken, from the questions that were made salient by teachers and parents and peers. And so the belief about free will, the position taken in the debate, is itself an example of the problem, is itself something that feels chosen but might be entirely determined by factors outside awareness, by neural predispositions toward optimism or pessimism, by whether the ventromedial prefrontal cortex happens to be more or less active, by whether early experiences created a sense of control or helplessness. And recognizing this creates a strange vertigo, a sense that even the attempt to think clearly about determinism is compromised by determinism, that there is no neutral ground from which to evaluate the question, because every evaluation is itself a product of the processes being evaluated. But this vertigo might be precisely the point, might be what the problem of free will is trying to teach, that the God's eye view, the view from nowhere that can assess everything without being part of anything, is impossible for creatures like humans, for beings that are always already embedded in causation, always already playing roles in dramas they did not write, and that the choice is not between being free and being determined, but between different ways of understanding determination, different ways of inhabiting the causal order, different stories about what it means to be the kind of being that thinks about these questions at all. Galen Strawson's basic argument, sometimes called the impossibility argument, proceeds through a series of simple steps that seem undeniable individually, but lead to a conclusion that most people want to reject. The argument begins by noting that to be truly responsible for an action, a person must be responsible for the way they are, for their character and values and decision-making processes. Because if those things were just given, were just accidents of birth and environment, then the person is not really the source of their action, is just a conduit through which prior causes flow into effects. But to be responsible for the way they are, they would need to have chosen to be that way, would need to have created themselves, and to have chosen to be a certain way requires already being a certain way, requires already having values and decision procedures that guide the choice, which means they would need to have chosen that prior way of being, and this regress continues indefinitely, backward through time, backward through the formation of character, and there is no point at which the person can be said to have created themselves ex nihilo, to have chosen without already being shaped by factors they did not choose. And so ultimate responsibility, the kind that seems required for true desert, for the idea that punishment is not just useful, but just, is impossible. Not just unlikely or unproven, but logically impossible, ruled out by the structure of causation itself. And if ultimate responsibility is impossible, then it is not clear what weaker sense of responsibility can do the moral work that needs doing, can justify the practices of praise and blame and punishment that structure human social life. Because those practices seem to presuppose that people are the ultimate sources of their actions, that they could have done otherwise, that they deserve what they get. And if none of that is true, then the practices start to look like remnants of a less enlightened time, like punishing the sick for being sick, like crediting the lucky for their luck, like a systematic confusion of causation with creation. The libertarians, the philosophers who insist that free will in the strong sense must exist, must be possible, have tried various strategies to escape this conclusion, have proposed that quantum indeterminacy might introduce genuine randomness into brain processes, that chaos theory might make long-term prediction impossible even in a deterministic system. That emergence might create new causal powers at higher levels of organization that are not reducible to lower levels. That agent causation might be a fundamental feature of reality alongside event causation, that persons might be substances that initiate causal chains without themselves being caused. But each of these strategies faces serious objections. The quantum indeterminacy strategy makes actions random rather than free, turns choice into a kind of neural roulette, where the outcome is not determined by reasons or values, but by the probabilistic decay of particles. And it is hard to see how this helps. How being subject to quantum chance is better than being subject to deterministic necessity, because in either case, the person is not in control, is not the author, is just the site where impersonal processes unfold, and the chaos theory strategy confuses unpredictability with indeterminacy, confuses the practical impossibility of prediction with the metaphysical possibility of doing otherwise, because a chaotic system is still deterministic, still has each state following necessarily from the prior state according to fixed rules. It is just that small differences in initial conditions lead to large differences in outcomes, which makes prediction impossible without perfect information. But this is an epistemic limitation, not an ontic one, not a gap in causation, but a gap in knowledge. And the emergent strategy seems to just rename the problem, to call the higher level patterns autonomous without explaining how autonomy is possible if the higher level supervenes on the lower level, if every higher level event is determined by lower level events. Because supervenience means that once the lower level is fixed, the higher level is fixed. There is no room for the higher level to do anything on its own, to add anything that is not already implicit in the base, and the agent causation strategy is the most mysterious of all, posits that persons are a different kind of thing than events, that they have the power to initiate change without being changed, to cause without being caused, but this seems to violate everything known about how the world works, seems to require something like a soul, an immaterial substance that can interact with matter but is not itself material, and the problems with dualism, with explaining how mind and body interact, how an immaterial thing can move a material thing without violating conservation of energy, have been well known since Descartes, and no libertarian has solved them, has shown how agent causation is possible in a world where everything else obeys natural law. Robert Kane, one of the most sophisticated contemporary libertarians, proposes that free will arises in moments of moral conflict, in situations where a person is torn between competing values, where the outcome is genuinely open, where quantum indeterminacies in the brain are amplified into macroscopic indeterminacy, and in these moments, the person's effort, their struggle to choose, creates a kind of self-forming action, a moment where they determine which values will win out. And subsequent actions, even if determined, are free in a derivative sense because they flow from a character that was shaped by these earlier free choices. But Kane's theory requires that these self-forming actions be both undetermined, so that the person could have chosen differently, and appropriately caused by the person's reasons and values, so that the choice is not just random, and it is not clear how both requirements can be satisfied simultaneously. Because if the choice is undetermined, then what makes it one choice rather than another? What explains why this value won rather than that value? And if the answer is that the person's reasons tipped the balance, then those reasons must have been causally efficacious, must have determined the outcome, which means the choice was not really undetermined after all, was not really open. And if the answer is that nothing tipped the balance, that the outcome was genuinely random, then it seems the person did not really choose, did not exercise agency, just got lucky or unlucky in which way the quantum coin flip landed. And calling this free will seems like a misuse of language, because freedom is not randomness, is not the absence of determination, but the right kind of determination, the kind that flows from the person's character and values, but those things are themselves not chosen, are themselves the product of prior causes. And so the circle closes again. The escape route turns out to lead back to the starting point. The debate sometimes shifts from whether free will exists to whether the concept is even coherent, whether it is possible to specify what libertarian free will would be like without running into contradictions, and some philosophers argue that the incoherence can be demonstrated a priori, that the very idea of an uncaused cause, of a being that initiates causal chains without being part of a causal chain itself, is as contradictory as a square circle, is a combination of terms that cannot be instantiated. And if this is right, then the debate is over. There is nothing to investigate empirically, because the thing being investigated is conceptually impossible. But other philosophers resist this conclusion, argue that the appearance of incoherence comes from trying to understand agency in terms of event causation, in terms of one event causing another, when really agency is its own category, is something that needs to be understood on its own terms, rather than reduced to the terms of physics. And this is a version of the emergent strategy, a claim that persons have causal powers that are not reducible to the causal powers of their parts. But the question remains how this is possible, how something can have powers that are not inherited from or determined by its components. And the usual answer involves appeal to organisation, to the idea that the way parts are arranged can create new properties that the parts do not have individually, the way water is wet even though individual H2O molecules are not wet, the way a song has a melody even though individual notes do not. But these examples do not really help, because wetness and melody are not causal powers, are not things that do work in the world, are just ways that we describe patterns. And the question about free will is not whether agency is a useful description, but whether it is a causal power, whether persons as such make things happen. And if the answer is yes, if persons have downward causal influence, then physics is incomplete. Then there are forces operating in the universe that are not captured by the standard model. And this is a radical claim, a claim that most scientists would reject. And the burden is on the libertarian to show why this claim should be accepted. What evidence could possibly demonstrate that there are person-level causal powers that violate or supplement the causal closure of the physical? Aristotle believed that everything happens either by necessity or by chance or by purpose. and he placed human action in the third category, argued that purpose is a genuine cause, that the final cause, the end toward which something aims, is as real as the efficient cause, the prior event that pushes it. And this teleological framework allowed Aristotle to preserve free will, to see human beings as self-movers, as creatures whose essence includes the capacity for rational choice, for deliberation about means and ends. And this capacity is not undermined by the fact that it has a natural basis, that it emerges from the kind of creatures humans are. Because for Aristotle, nature is purposive, is organised around functions and goals, and human nature includes rationality, includes the function of choosing well, and so free will is not a violation of nature, but an expression of it, is what humans do when they are functioning properly, when they are fully themselves. But this framework has been largely abandoned in modern science, which sees purposes not as causes, but as effects, not as explanations, but as things to be explained, because purposes are in minds, are representations of future states, and representations do not pull things toward them, do not reach back through time to cause present events. Instead, the appearance of purpose is explained by natural selection, by the fact that organisms whose behaviour approximates goal-directed action tend to survive and reproduce. And so purpose is not a fundamental feature of reality, but an emergent property of certain complex systems. And once this is understood, once teleology is naturalised, it is not clear that it can do the work Aristotle wanted it to do, can ground free will in a way that escapes the determinism of efficient causation. Because the purposes that guide action are themselves caused, are themselves the product of brain states that are the product of prior brain states. And the explanatory work is done by efficient causes, even if the folk psychological description uses purposive language. David Hume argued that the entire debate over free will rests on a confusion, that liberty and necessity are not incompatible, that everyone agrees that actions are caused by motives, and that motives are caused by character and circumstances, and that this kind of causation, far from threatening freedom, is what makes freedom possible, because freedom is not the absence of causation, but the absence of external constraint, the ability to act according to one's own desires rather than being forced by others, and disputes over whether these desires are themselves free, whether the character that produces them was freely chosen, are idle because they demand an impossible regress. They require that the person be causa sui, self-caused, which is absurd, which would make the person into a kind of god, and no one seriously believes this is possible. And so, the practical question, the only question that matters, is whether a person is acting from internal or external causes, whether they are being coerced or choosing, and this can be determined without answering metaphysical questions about ultimate responsibility, without needing to trace the causal chain back to the beginning of time. But Hume's solution, elegant as it is, seems to miss what motivates the free will debate, seems to dissolve the question rather than answer it, because people are not asking whether they can do what they want. They are asking whether they could have wanted differently, whether the wanting itself is within their control. And Hume's response is that this is a confused question, that wanting is not the kind of thing that can be controlled because control is itself a kind of wanting, is the exercise of a desire to modify desires. And so the question is asking whether desires are desired, which is either trivial if it just means that some desires are second order, or confused if it means something more metaphysical, something about standing outside the causal order and choosing which causal order to inhabit. The scientific image of human beings, the picture that emerges from neuroscience and genetics and evolutionary psychology, is of organisms whose behaviour is the product of mechanisms that were shaped by natural selection, that were not designed to track truth, but to promote survival and reproduction. And these mechanisms operate largely unconsciously, produce intuitions and emotions, and motivations that feel like direct perceptions of value, but are really just outputs of algorithms honed over millions of years. And from this perspective, the idea of free will looks like an evolutionary adaptation, a useful fiction that promotes cooperation by making people feel responsible, that enables the formation of stable social groups by creating the possibility of trust and blame, and the entire apparatus of moral life. And the fact that this fiction is adaptive does not make it true, does not mean that the conscious self really is making choices, really could have done otherwise. It just means that believing this helps genes propagate, helps groups cohere, helps individuals navigate complex social environments, and perhaps the evolution of consciousness itself is tied to the evolution of the free will illusion. Perhaps the feeling of being an agent, of having control, is what consciousness is for, is the function it performs. And in that case, asking whether free will exists is like asking whether a reflection exists. The reflection is real as a reflection, as an image in a mirror, but unreal as a substance, as something separate from the object it reflects. And consciousness might be similar, might be real as an experience but unreal as an entity. Might be a way that information processing feels from the inside without being a separate thing that does the processing. And the sense of agency might be part of this, might be the way that certain neural patterns feel, the way that conflict resolution and option evaluation and commitment to action feel when they are happening in a brain that can represent itself to itself. But this feeling, however powerful, however undeniable from the first-person perspective, might not correspond to anything in the causal structure of the world, might be an artifact of self-representation rather than a feature of self-causation. Thomas Nagel has suggested that the free will problem might be a permanent mystery, might be one of those questions where human cognitive architecture is simply not equipped to find an answer, where the attempt to reconcile the subjective and objective perspectives leads to antinomy, to conclusions that are equally well supported by reason, but mutually contradictory. And perhaps the right response is not to choose one side or the other, but to acknowledge the limitation, to accept that some truths might be beyond the reach of human understanding, not because they're mystical or supernatural, but because they require a kind of synthesis that human minds cannot achieve, a way of seeing that integrates first-person and third-person perspectives without losing either one. And such integration might require cognitive capacities that humans lack, might be possible only for beings with different neural architectures, different ways of processing information. And so the debate continues, not because one side is obviously right, but because both sides have access to genuine insights that resist integration. The determinist sees clearly that every event has causes, that the causal chain is unbroken, that to explain behavior is to show how it follows from prior conditions. And this is a powerful explanatory framework, has generated all of modern science, has made prediction and control possible. But the libertarian sees equally clearly that deliberation presupposes openness, that the experience of choosing is not the experience of watching predetermined outcomes unfold, but the experience of creating outcomes, of bringing into existence something that was not determined by what came before. And this experience is not easy to dismiss as illusion because it is so central to what it means to be human, so woven into the fabric of practical reasoning and interpersonal relationships. And perhaps both perspectives are true in some sense, that cannot be articulated in the conceptual vocabulary currently available. Perhaps the antinomy is a sign not of confusion, but of the limits of human thought. And the proper response is not to solve the problem, but to inhabit it, to live with the tension, to use deterministic thinking when it is useful and agential thinking when it is useful, without demanding that they be reconciled, without insisting on a single story that makes both make sense. The Stoics understood something like this when they distinguished between external necessitation, which compromises freedom, and internal necessitation, which constitutes it. When they argued that virtue consists in willing what happens, in aligning the will with fate so completely that there is no gap between what is willed and what occurs, And this might sound like giving up, like the ultimate resignation. But Marcus Aurelius experienced it as liberation, as the end of struggle, as peace achieved not through controlling circumstances, but through surrendering the need to control. And perhaps this is the practical wisdom that the free will debate points toward. Not a theoretical resolution, but an existential orientation, a way of being in the world that neither insists on control nor collapses into passivity, that acts with full commitment while knowing that outcomes are not guaranteed, that makes choices while understanding that the choosing is itself part of a larger pattern, that takes responsibility without imagining that responsibility traces back to an uncaused cause, that blames and praises provisionally, strategically, in ways that promote flourishing rather than as expressions of desert. And this might be the best that can be done, the most that can be achieved in the space between the subjective certainty of freedom and the objective evidence of determination. And perhaps the very fact that humans can think about these questions, can hold both perspectives simultaneously, can recognize the tension without resolving it, is itself significant, is what makes humans distinctive. Not that they are free in some metaphysical sense, but that they can ask whether they are free, can care about the answer, can shape their lives in response to the question, even if the question has no answer. And in that shaping, in that caring, there might be something worth calling agency, even if it is not the libertarian freedom that the folk concept demands, even if it is fully determined by prior causes, because what matters in the end is not whether the freedom is metaphysically ultimate, but whether the life is authentically lived, whether the person has engaged with the possibilities available to them, whether they have taken up their situation and made something of it. And this can be done, this can be achieved, regardless of where one stands in the free will debate, because it is not a matter of escaping causation, but of understanding it, of seeing how the past has shaped the present, and how the present is shaping the future. And in that, seeing there is a kind of freedom, the freedom that comes from knowledge, from understanding necessity rather than being blind to it, from choosing in the light rather than in the dark. And perhaps this is all the freedom there is, all the freedom there ever was, and perhaps it is enough. Consciousness might be a mistake, might be an accident, might be the unintended byproduct of neural complexity that serves no adaptive function and creates only suffering, only the awareness of suffering, only the recursive loop where the organism not only experiences pain, but knows that it is experiencing pain and anticipates future pain and remembers past pain and constructs narratives about why the pain is happening and what it means and whether it will ever end. And this layering, this meta-awareness, this capacity to be aware of being aware might be serving no purpose, might be adding nothing to survival except the burden of knowing, the weight of consciousness that makes existence heavier than it needs to be. Because a philosophical zombie, a creature that behaves exactly like a conscious being but has no inner experience, no subjective awareness, no what it is like, would survive just as well, would reproduce just as effectively, would navigate the world just as successfully, but would do so without suffering, without the felt quality of pain, without the agony that comes not from the pain itself, but from being aware of the pain, from experiencing it subjectively rather than just responding to it mechanically. And the mechanical response is all that is needed, is all that evolution requires, is the behavior that increases fitness, and fitness does not require consciousness, does not need awareness, does not benefit from the addition of subjective experience to the processing of information. Because information processing can happen in the dark, can happen without anyone home, can happen in systems that are as complex as needed, without ever generating the feeling of what it is like to be that system. And the feeling is the problem, is the accident, is the thing that might have no function, might be epiphenomenal, might be floating above the causal machinery without affecting it, without contributing to it, just observing, just witnessing, just being aware of what the brain is doing without having any power to change it. And if this is true, if consciousness is epiphenomenal, if it is causally inert, then it is not an adaptation, is not something that was selected for, is not serving any evolutionary purpose, is just a side effect, just the way that certain kinds of information processing feel from the inside, and the feeling is the accident, is the thing that did not need to happen, that adds nothing except suffering, except the awareness that makes pain painful, that makes fear frightening, that makes existence a burden rather than just a set of processes. And the processes could run without consciousness, could operate in the dark, could generate all the same behaviors without anyone experiencing them, without anyone being there to suffer through them. And if no one is there, then there is no suffering, is no problem, is just mechanism, just cause and effect, just the physical universe doing what it does. And what it does is not painful, except when consciousness is present, except when there is someone to whom it is happening, someone for whom the pain is not just physical damage, but is experience, is suffering, is the felt quality that makes damage matter in a way that it would not matter to a zombie, to a system that responds to damage without experiencing it, without feeling it, without being anyone to whom the feeling is happening, and the being someone is the accident, is the thing that might have gone wrong, that might have been a wrong turn in the evolution of nervous systems, a glitch in the development of brains that became too complex, that crossed some threshold where information processing generated awareness, generated the sense of being a subject, of being the one to whom experience is happening, and the happening is the problem, is the creation of a locus of suffering, a point where the universe becomes painful to itself, where matter becomes aware of its own damage, its own decay, its own inevitable dissolution. And this awareness serves no function, helps nothing, is pure cost, pure burden, pure the addition of suffering to a universe that could have operated just as well without it. And the just as well is the tragedy, is the recognition that consciousness might be unnecessary, might be superfluous, might be the thing that makes existence worse without making survival better, that creates subjective horror without creating objective advantage, that turns the neutral mechanics of damage and death into the experienced agony of pain and mortality. And the agony is what distinguishes conscious beings from non-conscious ones, is what makes suffering possible, is what creates the problem that is called the problem of consciousness, the hard problem, the question of why there is something it is like to be anything, why information processing in certain systems generates awareness, generates experience, generates the sense of being someone to whom things are happening, and the why has no answer, has no explanation that is satisfying, has no story that makes the accident make sense except as accident, as the thing that was not intended, not designed, not selected for, just emerged, just appeared, just started happening when brains became complex enough. And the complex enough might be the threshold, might be the point where mechanism becomes experience, where processing becomes awareness. But what is that threshold? What is the difference between a system that is conscious and a system that is not? And the difference cannot be in the behavior, cannot be in the function, because zombies by definition behave identically to conscious beings, while having no inner experience, and so the difference must be in something else, in some additional property that consciousness has, some extra feature that awareness brings. But what is that feature? What does consciousness add? And the answer might be nothing, might be that consciousness adds nothing except itself, nothing except the fact of being experienced, nothing except the transformation of mechanism into suffering, of process into pain, of neutral physical events into the subjective horror that characterizes conscious existence. And the horror is not universal, is not constant, is mixed with pleasure, with satisfaction, with moments of peace, but the mixing does not eliminate the problem, does not justify the accident, because the pleasure is also temporary, is also followed by its absence, is also creating the suffering of loss, of wanting, of the gap between what is and what's desired. And the desiring is what consciousness does, is the evaluation of states, the assignment of positive and negative valence, the creation of preferences. And preferences are the root of suffering, are the thing that makes neutral events into problems, into threats, into sources of pain, because without preferences there is no problem. There is just what is, just the universe doing what it does. And what it does is neither good nor bad, is just process, just change, just the rearrangement of matter according to physical law. And the law is indifferent, is not caring, is not aware, is not conscious. And if consciousness had not appeared, if the accident had not happened, then the universe would still be indifferent, would still be doing what it does, but there would be no one to suffer from it, no one to care, no one to experience the indifference as painful, as hostile, as threatening. And the threatening is projection, is the imposition of consciousness onto the universe, the reading of intention into mechanism, the creation of meaning, where there is only causation, and the causation is enough, is all that is needed, is the explanation that requires no consciousness, no awareness, no experience, just the physical facts, just the matter interacting, just the fields fluctuating, and these processes could run forever without generating suffering, without creating pain, without producing the awareness that makes existence feel like something. And the feeling like something is the accident, is the thing that went wrong, is the emergence of subjectivity in a universe that does not need it, that does not benefit from it. That is made worse by it, because worse requires consciousness, requires someone to whom things can be worse. And without that someone there is no worse, there is no better. There is just what is, and what is neutral, is neither good nor bad, is just the physical universe doing what physical universes do, and doing it in the dark, without awareness, without anyone watching, without anyone experiencing it. And the experiencing is the mistake, is the accident, is the thing that creates suffering without creating any compensating benefit. Because the benefits that consciousness seems to provide, the ability to plan, to reason, to communicate, to cooperate, can all be done by zombies, can all be accomplished by systems that process information without experiencing it, that behave intelligently without being aware, that respond to the world without feeling anything. And the feeling is the extra, is the addition that might be pointless, might be functionless, might be the cost without benefit, the burden without purpose, the suffering without justification. And the justification is what consciousness seeks, is what the awareness demands, is the question of why. Why is there pain? Why is there suffering? Why is existence so difficult? And the answer might be that there is no why, that the pain is meaningless, that the suffering serves no purpose, that existence is. Difficult because consciousness makes it difficult, because awareness transforms neutral events into experienced horror, because subjectivity is the accident that created the problem. And the problem is not solvable, is not fixable, is not something that can be addressed except by eliminating consciousness itself, by returning to the zombie state, by going back to the condition of processing without experiencing, of responding without feeling, of existing without being aware of existing. And the existing without awareness is what rocks do, is what atoms do, is what most of the universe does. And the most of the universe is not suffering, is not in pain, is not experiencing anything at all, is just being, just existing, just occupying space and time without anyone being there to experience the occupation. And the rocks are not happy, are not feeling peace, are not in any state that could be called positive, but they are also not suffering, are not in pain, are not experiencing anything negative, are not experiencing anything at all. And the not experiencing might be better than experiencing, might be the preferable state, might be what consciousness should envy rather than what it should pity, because the rocks have no problems, have no suffering, have no awareness that makes existence difficult, and existence is not difficult for them, is not anything for them, is just what they are, just the configuration of atoms that happens to be shaped like a rock. And the shaping is not experienced, is not felt, is not creating any inner life, any subjectivity, any sense of being a rock. And the sense of being is what consciousness is the thing that makes existence feel like something. And the feeling might be the problem, might be the thing that should not have happened, that was not necessary, that serves no function except to create suffering, to make damage painful, to make existence burdensome. And the burden is carried by every conscious being, is the weight of awareness, the cost of subjectivity, the price of being someone to whom things happen. And the happening is neutral at the physical level, is just cause and effect, just mechanism. But at the conscious level, it is experienced, is felt, is transformed into suffering or pleasure, or some mixture of both. And the mixture is what characterizes conscious life, is the oscillation between states, the pursuit of positive states and the avoidance of negative states. And the pursuit and avoidance are exhausting, are never-ending, are the cycle that consciousness is trapped in, is condemned to because it cannot help but evaluate, cannot help but prefer, cannot help but want things to be different than they are. And the wanting is the suffering, is what the Buddha recognized, is what the first noble truth teaches, that consciousness and suffering are inseparable, are two sides of the same coin, are the inevitable pairing that emerges when awareness appears, when subjectivity emerges, when there is someone to whom the universe is happening, and the happening is the problem, is the thing that creates suffering, is the accident that consciousness is, and the accident might not have needed to happen, might have been avoidable, might have been a wrong turn that evolution took, a path that led to a dead end, to a state that creates more cost than benefit, more suffering than advantage, more burden than any possible evolutionary payoff could justify, because the payoff is measured in survival and reproduction, is measured in fitness, and fitness does not require consciousness, does not need awareness, does not benefit from the addition of suffering to the equation. And so the suffering is gratuitous, is unnecessary, is the cost of an accident that serves no purpose, and the purposeless is what makes consciousness tragic, is what makes existence absurd, is what suggests that awareness is not feature but bug, not adaptation but malfunction, not the pinnacle of evolution, but its mistake, its wrong turn, its creation of something that should not exist, that adds nothing except the capacity to suffer. And the capacity is realized, is actualized, is filling the universe with pain that would not exist without consciousness. That is created by consciousness. That is the direct result of awareness emerging in a universe that does not need it, does not want it, does not benefit from it, just tolerates it, just allows it to happen because there is no mechanism to prevent it, no selection pressure strong enough to eliminate it once it appears, because consciousness does not reduce fitness enough to be selected against, is not harmful enough to survival, to be eliminated by evolution, is just costly enough to make existence miserable without making it impossible. And the miserable is what consciousness creates, is what awareness produces, is the transformation of neutral mechanism into experienced suffering. And the suffering is universal among conscious beings, is not limited to humans, is present in any creature with awareness, with subjectivity, with the sense of being someone to whom pain is happening. And the happening is the accident, is the mistake, is the thing that went wrong when brains became complex enough to generate consciousness. And the generating is the mystery, is the hard problem, is the question that has no answer. How does mechanism become experience? How does processing become awareness? How does matter become mind? And the how is unknown is perhaps unknowable. It is perhaps the wrong question. Because maybe mechanism does not become experience. Maybe processing does not become awareness. Maybe consciousness is not produced by brains but is something else, something additional, something that exists alongside the physical, without being reducible to it. But this dualism creates more problems than it solves, creates the interaction problem, creates the question of how consciousness could affect behavior if it is not physical, how awareness could matter if it is not part of the causal chain. And so dualism is rejected, is abandoned, is replaced by the view that consciousness is physical, is produced by brains, is the result of neural activity. But this physicalism does not explain, does not solve the hard problem, does not show how neurons firing could generate experience, could create the felt quality of pain, could produce the sense of being someone. And the production remains mysterious, remains unexplained, remains the accident that has no mechanism, no process, no explanation for why it happens. And the why it happens might have no answer, might be that it just does, might be that consciousness is what certain kinds of information processing feel like from the inside, and the from the inside is the addition, is the thing that might be pointless, might be epiphenomenal, might be floating above the mechanism without affecting it, just experiencing what is happening without having any power to change what is happening. And if this is true, then consciousness is truly an accident, is truly pointless, is truly the cost without benefit, the burden without function, the suffering without purpose. And the purpose is what consciousness seeks, is what awareness demands, is what makes the accident unbearable. Because consciousness does not just suffer, it also asks why, it also seeks meaning, it also demands justification. And the justification is not there, is not available, is not possible if consciousness is accident, if awareness is mistake, if subjectivity is the thing that went wrong, the bug in the system, the malfunction that creates suffering without creating anything else, without adding anything except the capacity to be aware of the suffering, to experience it subjectively, to be someone to whom the pain is happening, and the someone is the accident, is the emergence of subjectivity, is the appearance of the sense of being a self. And the self might be illusion, might be construct, might be the way that certain information processing patterns feel from the inside. But even if the self is illusion, the suffering is real, is felt, is experienced, is the undeniable fact of consciousness that there is something it is like to be this, to be here, to be aware. And the awareness is the problem, is the mistake, is the accident that creates suffering. And the suffering might be the only thing that consciousness does, the only function it serves, the only result it produces is the transformation of mechanism into misery, of process into pain, of the neutral universe into the experienced horror, of being aware, of being conscious, of being someone to whom things happen. And the happening is the accident, is the mistake, is the thing that should not have been, that was not necessary, that serves no purpose except to create the suffering that characterizes conscious existence. And the existence might be worse than non-existence, might be worse than the zombie state, might be worse than being a rock, because the rock does not suffer, does not experience, does not have any problems, and problems require consciousness, require awareness, require someone to whom things can be problems. And without that someone, there are no problems. There is just what is, just the universe being universe, just matter doing what matter does. And what it does is not painful, except to consciousness, except to awareness, except to the accident that should not have happened, that creates only suffering, that adds only burden, that produces only the sense that existence is too much, is too heavy, is too painful. And the painful is what consciousness makes it, is what awareness creates, is what the accident produces, and the production might have been avoidable, might have been preventable, might have been the wrong turn that evolution took, the mistake that created consciousness, created awareness, created the suffering that fills the universe wherever consciousness appears, wherever awareness emerges, wherever the accident happens, and the accident keeps happening, keeps producing new conscious beings, new centers of suffering, new locations where the universe becomes painful to itself. And the becoming is the tragedy, is the ongoing mistake, is the continuous accident that creates suffering without purpose, awareness without function, consciousness without benefit, and the without benefit is what makes it accident, is what makes it mistake, is what suggests that consciousness is not the pinnacle of evolution but its error, its malfunction, its creation of something that should not exist, that serves no purpose, that adds nothing except suffering, and the suffering is enough, is sufficient, is the complete description of what consciousness does, is the total function it serves, is the only thing it produces, is the transformation of a universe that could have been neutral, that could have been just mechanism, that could have been just process, into a universe that is painful, that is experienced, that is conscious. And consciousness might be the worst thing that ever happened, might be the mistake that should never have been made, might be the accident that creates all the suffering in the universe. And the universe without consciousness would not be worse, would not be better, would just be different, would just be what it is without anyone experiencing it, without anyone suffering from it, without anyone being aware that it exists. And the awareness is the problem, is the accident, is the mistake, is the thing that makes existence heavy, makes life difficult, makes consciousness the burden that every aware being carries, the weight of subjectivity, the cost of being someone, the price of the accident that is awareness. And the awareness might be the only truly terrible thing, the only thing that creates genuine suffering, the only thing that transforms neutral mechanism into experienced horror. And the horror is what consciousness is what awareness produces, is what the accident creates. And the creating continues, will continue, as long as consciousness persists, as long as awareness emerges, as long as the accident keeps happening, keeps producing new suffering, new pain, new examples of why consciousness might be mistake, might be bug, might be the thing that went wrong. And the going wrong is irreversible, is permanent, is the condition of being conscious, of being aware, of being the accident that experiences itself, that knows itself, that suffers from the knowledge that it might be pointless, might be functionless, might be the mistake that creates all suffering, all pain, all the burden of being conscious, and consciousness might wish it had never happened, might prefer non-existence to existence, might envy the rocks, the zombies, the universe before awareness, before the accident, before consciousness emerged and created suffering where there had been only mechanism, only process, only the neutral operations of a universe that did not need consciousness, did not want consciousness, did not benefit from consciousness, but got consciousness anyway, got awareness, got subjectivity, got the accident that is the only source of suffering, the only creator of pain, the only reason that existence is experienced as burden rather than just accepted as fact. And the fact is neutral, is neither good nor bad, is just what is. But consciousness makes it bad, makes it painful, makes it suffering. And the making is the accident, is the mistake, is why consciousness might be the worst thing that ever happened. The error that creates all problems, the bug that produces all pain, the malfunction that is awareness, that is subjectivity, that is consciousness, and consciousness is the accident. And the accident might have been the biggest mistake in the history of the universe.